Hey guys, this is Sujayram, and here is Joshua from Philippines, and he is a Flutter expert and dot expert. And today's event topic is cross-platform powered apps. And yeah, let's get started. Yeah, you can go
All
ahead, Joshua.
all right, sure thing. Like
Yeah,
I think my camera is, I'm not sure, it's blurring. All right.
yeah,
Yeah. Um, First of all, thanks for coming. Thanks for inviting me, Sujay, for this event. And yeah, at least for this workshop, this talk is our goal is for us kind of like provide some judgment of cross-platform tools like Flutter is something that we can use for our apps or for our projects. And I'm not sure if I can move. And yeah, just to give you a brief overview of what I do, I'm currently working for a startup company, working mainly on investing apps, Google Developer Expert for Flutter, and one of the co-organizers of Flutter Philippines. And right now, the world we live in today, like we've been using apps a lot, like from Windows, desktop apps for Mac, Linux, TV apps, and especially for web and mobile apps. And a lot of these apps serve one purpose is to kind of like, and that is to kind of like help us with our day-to-day lives, entertain us, help us with our problem from finance to travel, and a lot of sorry like it's not moving, and a lot of these apps that we're using today is being distributed to millions of users, generating billions in revenues for some of the biggest companies in the world. And we're here in the context of talking about options and tools that you can use for building your apps and using cross-platform tools in order for you to deliver the product that you have from idea to actually to the hand, like delivering them to the hands of the user. So um, at least in this slide, like mobile is in the context of this talk, and like mobile apps is predicted to kind of like reach over a trillion, you know, in terms of like revenue. So it's really crucial for us, dev shops or probably agencies to try out at least, or even ideas to try out at least to reach our users through the mobile platform, because there's a ton of users that have their devices with them and it's super cheap, like for someone to kind of like own a mobile device. And like we're talking about a lot regarding market share, and I think this is just the market share um, in a specific locality. And as you can see here, two of the major platforms that um, owns the market share are both Android and iOS, at least again in the context of mobile. And there are two ways, on how someone could build a mobile app today. So right now, one of at least uh, two best, like two most two common ways on how to build apps. So one is native, where we kind of like use languages like Swift for iOS, Kotlin for Android. Previously, if you have Touch native code, like you might have probably have been using Objective C back then, or Java for native Android. And at least the other alternative is cross-platform. So for cross-platform, these allows the developers to work on a single code base and in hope, to help them run their code anywhere. But that's not always the case for most tools. So with this, with these tools, you are required to learn the framework, the tooling, and the language that it comes with it when building your apps. Native code comes with different challenges, you having to have a separate theme for Android and iOS, you having to like to implement the features twice, just because again they're written on different languages. Swift for iOS, Kotlin for Android, and your team have to maintain different build tools, CI/CD pipelines, write different tests for common scenarios or same logic of your app. But again, no, like with the challenges, writing code in native still has a lot of advantage and wins. You know, one is writing code in native allows you to code or to execute your code much faster and build apps that are performant, meaning whenever they're installed to the app of the users, assuming you have good code, um, you should be able to kind of like run your app in like a like without much log or kind of like much bloated feeling to the users. And having different platform specific code or project will allow to bring, allow your product to kind of like bring a specific UX to the platform you're targeting. So whether it's Android, material design, or iOS, Cupertino design, or specific behaviors really for those platforms, it's super easy to do just because you're doing things differently. You have way much control on the platform because you can control or talk to the native components directly with the SDKs provided to you by each of these platforms. It's feature reach and you get the latest updates. So, for example, whenever their device changes from flip phones to notification updates from the device or OS itself, using native platforms get the latest updates from the developer team, like like Apple for Swift, Google for Android. In contrary, cross platforms also has it. Like cross platform. So you know, cross platform as well has its own challenges. So one is the opposite of one you get from native code is difficulty on making the experience consistent with the platform. So just because you're coding with, for example, a single code base, um, it'll be it'll be a lot of like if you're planning on targeting different experiences and you're using the wrong tool, you'll end up having a bunch of conditions depending on how you want to kind of like like your features be perceived on different platforms. There are a couple of abstractions like from using a native library, just because like frameworks or tools like Flutter or React Native sits on top of the native like SDKs, and it might take time, for some features to get included on the SDKs, just because I think it's still being ported uh, by the code owners like Facebook or Google to the SDK, or waiting for some contributors to actually get a fix out for those platforms. Moving and as well, like native, like native app, cross-platform also has its wins. Like building cross-platform apps, it's definitely way faster than coding in native. Again, I'm just using like faster, but again, it still depends on the experience or the learning curve of the tool that you're using. But we'll talk more about that shortly. You have same developers working on a single framework or language, same code base, deploy on two different platforms in most cases, but again, there's still some factors affecting it. You have same build tools, CI/CD pipelines, and tests for almost all cases. And for some companies that have tight deadlines or shorter in terms of like dev resources, it's much more cost efficient to hire someone that knows how to code in one of these tools and deploy, hopefully without so much platform specific fixes on iOS and Android. And we'll just focus on these three really. Like there are a couple of tools out there other than these three, like Ionic and Cordova, which is a hybrid one, and that approach is kind of like is really dependent on you using a web view within your apps. For example, if you're trying to extend a feature of your app, you'll be adding web views and render those specific pages that you built in your app. which in some cases it's not really something that you may need. No, like for example, if you are considering displaying a very sophisticated data chart, like it may take time for the web view to actually render that, like on lower devices or devices with really slow internet or something. It may take time for it to kind of like render those data. But again, our options here is uh our options here right now is now the three things, but we'll discuss Flutter more in depth rather than at least in this workshop. So, or in this talk. So at least for Xamarin, it's initially released on 2012, creating with Xamarin, and it's currently being maintained by Microsoft. It uses C Sharp, and it's built for you to be able to kind of like create apps for mobile and desktop apps. React Native uses JavaScript, helps you build on mobile, Windows, and TV apps. It was released in 2015, created by Facebook. It's also open source, and um, the newcomer for at least it's not already a newcomer. It's been out 3 years, or almost 4 years ago, and it's Flutter. It's a toolkit for building user interfaces for platforms like the ones we're talking right now, Android and iOS, both for mobile platforms, but it also supports web and desktop. And it uses Dart language. It's for some of you who might not have heard of what Dart is. It's an object-oriented programming language used for both writing Flutter apps and also server-side code. And again, with React Native, going back here, it also allows you to write, at least with React, if you're previously using React JS, you know like, at some point you can also reuse some code here. But we're talking specifically React Native here, so I haven't explicitly mentioned that can be used for web. But yeah, there's a counterpart here, React JS, and code reuse can be done there as well. So these for cross-platform stuff, I think there's a bunch of tools out there, but we'll just focus on Flutter right now. And hopefully, if you have, if you have seen how we use Flutter today, you'll at least this will at least I hope this will at least encourage you to try it out, using it for your apps. So Flutter, again, it's a toolkit built for you to run your apps on different screen, whenever wherever like, your components needed to be run, whether it's on watch, whether it's on desktop, whether it's on Linux, Windows, literally everywhere. But again, there's specific configurations for those platforms that we might not be able to discuss in depth today. And now one of the value propositions of Flutter is that it compiles native machine code. Like with Flutter, you are you are writing in Dart, and whenever you're doing hot reload, it's spins up a VM so that you can do iterative development, or you can push changes without recompiling the code. But with Flutter, it also compiles your code to native machine code, meaning that whenever you create an APK, it compiles ahead of time. Whenever the user opens the app for the first time, it doesn't need that much time to actually load all the code that your app has. And that's Flutter, again, supports iterative development. You can test and sit down with your designer literally, so that whenever you have design changes or new components added, you can just simply rerun the app without you having to recompile again the entire app. So I have two options: hot reload or hot restart, meaning we're starting from the initial state of the app, or hot reload, it just kind of like changes the design or the components of your app, whatever you left on the screen. And Flutter has a lot more to offer. I think one of the um, at least like something that I truly appreciate from Flutter is that it comes with the material and Cupertino package. It really helps a lot in terms of like like developers doing their prototype apps or testing with Flutter, having these widgets out of the box, you are empowered to kind of like just focus on building the features rather than creating these components that allows you to build those features. So that's really super helpful. Um, Another is packages on flutter.dev. So with Flutter, we have this website called pub.dev, and the pub.dev hosts all the packages and dependencies that you might need, no, for your Flutter packages. So, for example, you are looking for a charts plugin or package. You can just go over pub.dev and search for the charts package. Um, Last thing that I want to point out, but again, Flutter still has a lot more to offer, is the community. So right now, what we're doing here is, like we're creating Flutter experiences for you. The community in Flutter, whether it's on Twitter, Medium, everyone's welcoming. Now, if you have questions, if you have something that you're super interested in asking, we're more than happy to help you on your concern. Again, Flutter comes out with material, widgets, and there's a showcase that you can test. I'll just forward the link in a few. Above the dev package website where you can search the the plugins that you might need for camera, Bluetooth, so that you don't have to write it yourself. Oh wait, again, a few months ago, like Flutter released a new version of Flutter, which introduced more features to the developers and as again is beneficial to your users. Uh, because Flutter has already released a games toolkit for you to create games on Flutter with much less time and effort. Like with Flutter Games Toolkit allows to create 2D games using Flutter. Um, a lot more has been improved with Flutter. This is kind of like an example app on Superlist. So I think there's an they have created a bunch of awesome packages as well for Flutter. And yeah, like I think enough of the features that we like Flutter has. Maybe we can try some short live coding. If you can share my screen, that will be super helpful. All right, thanks. All right, so we've been talking Flutter a lot in its features from hot reload and things like that, but we'll actually, um, like, how does it actually feel now if we're working on that project? So this one, I'm using a real device, but it's just emulated on um, my screen. So I'm touching the plus button on my screen. But yeah, let's try closing, or let's try creating a new project. Flutter create some Techrodai. This is a command for creating a Flutter app. So Flutter creates a project name. I think we still have a few more minutes. So I think we can just test out a few changes here. Mm. All right, so the project is created at Techrodai. Right, so this is the code. Um, Again, we'll only discuss Flutter in this talk and not the other cross-platform tools, but yeah, let me try opening this one. So let's just go over quickly the structure. I think it's lagging a bit. Hopefully it's visible. Okay. Oh, the basic structure of a Flutter project is what you see on this screen. So if you try creating a new Flutter project, it will give you all the directories that you need to configure your app to run on these platforms. Like for example, Android, iOS, Mac OS, and Windows. But we'll only just focus on really on the lib directory, which is the like main entry point of your Flutter app in this run app. and will not do any platform specific changes. So when you mean platform specific changes, for example, I need to change something on Android, right? I have to code in Kotlin. When I need to change something in iOS, I have to code in Swift. That's probably something that you have to do in the most certainly, but not super soon if you're just trying out Flutter. So you have to deal with this code only when you're, for example, stuck with a specific plugin, specific issue with Android, or specific issue with iOS. But right now, we'll just focus on the main.dart file. So the entry point of your Flutter app is the main callback, and it runs or executes your app and paints it on the on the device by calling run app. And this my app is a stateless widget that calls a material app. So right now, as you can see here, there's a home property here, and this home property calls another widget, which is again as like a widget in Flutter can be either a stateless or stateful widget. Again, the only difference between a stateless and stateful widget is that a stateless widget doesn't hold an internal state, but a stateful widget has a state class that can hold state changes during runtime, meaning when your app is running, like you can, for example, persist these changes. So for example, right now I'm tapping this button, and the state changes happens here is that, for example, this 17 turns to 18. That's the state changes. So at least we'll not deep dive into stateful and stateless widget, but rather just try to really iterate on the Flutter code changes. So for example, I want to change something with the title. So right now I'm passing the title for the demo homepage from the My App. But what if I want to change it to something like Techrodai? Oops. Right now I'm not. I forgot. This is running from a different project, so I have to run the code. Flutter run first. So Techrodai, Flutter run. I'm running Flutter run within the code where pubspec.yaml is found. So pubspec.yaml, super important part of the Flutter project as well, is kind of like a manifest. It describes what the dependencies are for your Flutter project, what are the versioning of those dependencies, and what is the version of that specific Flutter project, and a couple more stuff here, like from adding assets to um, changing the font style, things like that. So right now I'm running on my Pixel device, so this should be out in a few. Okay, while waiting, I guess we could go back to the code. And again, like the file extensions of the code that you're touching for most part, right now are using Dart extensions, meaning this code that you're actually touching is using Dart file and widgets that come from the material package. So there will be some parts of your app where like you will not be using the material package. For example, if you're writing API services file, or you're writing a logic class, like similar to OOP files, you only need to import the material package only when like you have to use or display a widget on the screen. So I think this takes time. Mm-mm-mm. So I guess while we're waiting, um, mm, I think right now this is just a bit slow just because it's the first time running and I have a lot of resources open right now, from screen sharing to like demoing this app. But I think I have. Oh yeah, I think it's closed. I think if give it one more minute, if it's not opening, we can simply switch. Uh,
Hey Joshua, Can you hear
Mm,
me?
yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. In the time, there are some questions here. We can
Sure.
just, yeah, we can just complete that.
Yeah, definitely. All right.
Yeah.
So, one question by the viewer. Hmm. Native or cross-platform, which is good for speed? So I think we'll discuss that in a few after the slide. But to answer your question, I think it depends. As I mentioned a while ago, it depends on the factor that you have. So, for example, if you have developers that are experts in native development, it makes more sense to kind of like have them, like, and you have a short deadline. Yeah, it makes more sense to kind of like have them code a native language. For example, if they're good at Android or iOS, then it makes sense for them to kind of like do it. But then have them invest learning in tools like again, I think it depends on the timeline. But if you have probably reasonable timeline for them to kind of like learn Flutter, which is probably if you've been coding native code before, it should have a low bar entry, special for native devs. So two factors you have to consider: dev resources and the timeline of the project that you're building. But in terms of like uh, app speed, in terms of like performance, definitely native is wins on this specific area, but probably by marginal um, difference. And it's not like significant difference in terms of like performance, because Flutter already provides you rendering, like on can render GP, like your screens on devices GPU for 60 or 120 refresh rates. So like really, Flutter uh, is almost on par with native, but again, native is still faster. If I am to answer the app speed in terms of like performance, a while ago I answered the question app speed in terms of like app speed development. Um, yeah, sorry. I think we have one more question. Is Flutter more powerful than React Native? Again, I think this is a bit subjective again. Um, Depending on your team, depending on the expertise and experience of the team, using the right tools for the right team and the right project is probably how would I approach it on terms of like how a tool can be powerful. So, like in terms of like comparing them, like really upfront, I think there are a couple of factors that you really have to test against your team. So it might work great for our team just because probably we're native developers, but it might not work great for a team of web developers that wants to try out Flutter and they have very short time deadline for doing so. So it's it's subjective. So that's probably I'll leave it there. It depends. Right, so it's already running just in time to end the talk. So right now, this is Techrodai trending the changes. Techrodai 2. If I press R on the hot reload, it immediately changes. I can also change the theme color from purple and press R. Again, those are kind of like the example ways on how you can do iterative development, but we can also design a widget super quick right now. What if I want to kind of like have a box? I will have a container with a height of 100, width of 200, and I want it to kind of like have curves. For example, wanted to have color of red. I wanted to have curves. Right now, I'm just talking it out, but I'm actually doing the change right as I type in the code. Right. So for much more complex designs, like for example, with text or with different shapes, like you can use custom painter for those. Or like if you want to create a widget, like that can be extracted or reused. Like for example, right now I can copy this code and duplicate it for me to create a a copy of that specific widget within the screen. But a good way to do that, if you're planning on, for example, like calling that widget again on a different screen, is to create your own widget. So for example, red container. So right now I'm just copying the code that we've added a while ago directly on this specific page widget and calling the red container here. For example, I call it once, call it twice, call it thrice, without copying the code that I've written here. So as you can see here, I only just written this specific code once, but I can call the container a couple of times from the code. So at least that's the concept of creating more widgets for parts of your app that can be reused. So similarly, there are a lot of out-of-the-box widgets from Material Package, so you can call them as well like this, and you can just modify them by the parameters that they're exposing. And going back to the slide, if we can open the slide. Right. So a couple of things that you can consider. Again, so the questions, it depends on what really is powerful or which is faster in terms of like development, um, based on your team resources or based on your skill if you're doing a solo project. So developer experience is something that you have to consider because it involves a couple of non-technical aspects like the morale, the like the motivation for the developers to build a project, super important, and the experience, what experience they can use to help you build a project. That's super important as well. Another thing that you want to consider is the long-term investment. For example, if you're building a flagship product, you may want to kind of like okay, let me just move this screen. So you may want to kind of like have your developers like or have your developers test against these tools on whether you're planning on scaling in a few months or in a long term, or you're planning on building your product roadmap. What would the product look like? How many engineers will work on the project? Things like that you have to consider, and the costs. So at least for the cost, it's pretty straightforward for the business. How much dev resources are going to allocate for the project, or how much money will you put in on the project. So that kind of like gives you an idea on how roughly a tool or cross-platform tool is likely going to be chosen as an alternative way of building their mobile apps. But again, for cross-platform apps, one of the benefits that you can get here, it's efficient in terms of like costs, just because you have to hire only one developers for probably super small app. But if you're planning on targeting or building an app with different platform specific features like camera, Bluetooth, you may need someone that knows both Android and iOS, if in case you're stuck with a native issue or platform specific bugs that you've experienced with a package or plugins. Last but not least, like recently, Flutter has been on top of the survey from Stack Overflow, and it's one of the most used. Again, this depends heavily on the Stack Overflow service data, but what this data says is that Flutter is being used a lot, way more than React Native, based on the rates and survey. And just like any other tools, Flutter is something that you can try out, something that you can play around with in terms of like, like doing POCs or prototyping for your project. But a lot of companies, especially big ones, are already using it as well for their projects, including farmer companies been using it a lot for production apps. So I'll leave it there. And last but not least is that cross-platform tools like Flutter, React Native, in the end are tools in addition to the native platforms or SDKs that you can use for building mobile apps, and it's up to your team to decide, really based on the evaluation criteria, based on how like your developers build apps with those tools, how your company is planning on putting money on that project, or um, another criteria is probably how your company is planning on maintaining or supporting the app long term. Will there be more engineers working on it, or will there be less? So there's no one single answer for which is the best, but I'm here just outlining kind of like my judgment for Flutter as a good way to start like your cross-platform journey. So it's pretty much it from my end. Hey, hey, Sujai, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here, Joshua.
Right.
Yeah, I think one more question is there by
Sure.
Vibhu. Yeah,
All right. So the question is, how good is web development when it comes to Flutter? Uh, right. So, um, the way I would see it right now, it's positioned um, to create apps, like apps for your website that doesn't need probably much SEO. Like for example, if you're doing blog site, would probably makes more sense to kind of like um, try low barrier web tools like CMS or like for blogging. But if you're planning on building apps that are like has rich set of features, like for example trading and stuff like that, that doesn't really need that much SEO, but much more focused on really an actual app for web, like apps with feature, web apps with um, uh, like gating for authentication. I think web for Flutter is good. But I think right now, at least for my personal experience, I think it's a challenge to use or to do the navigation at the moment. Maybe it's just me trying playing around with the web framework, but I think a lot of companies that I've seen have been using it already. Um, I think this, in terms of like how good it is, I would recommend trying it out and see if it fits your use case. But again, because it really depends on your use case again. So as I mentioned earlier, if you're planning on doing blogging, might be a challenge to do SEO. But if you're planning on building an actual web app with features, authentication, things like that, or payments, this could be something that you can try for a project.
okay, Joshua. The questions are over, Joshua.
All right, sure thing.
Yeah,
All right, so I think we can end here, right?
yeah, we can end it now. Thank you
All right.
for watching the live, and we will be come with another a good event. And thank you everyone for watching the live. Bye.